Blazor is a huge new piece of technology at Microsoft. It is so amazing that while it's not yet out of preview mode, I want to show off some of the power of what it can do. Now, if you're not familiar with Blazor, think of it as C# on the client side. Instead of powering our web applications with JavaScript on the front end, using Blazor, we can run C# code to do the same thing. In this video, we will see what Blazor is, how to build a project with it, and how to use it to connect to an API to receive and post data. I do want to stress that this video is going to show off cutting-edge, work-in-progress technology. Blazor is not yet ready for production. There are still a lot of quirks to be worked out, and I'll show you how to get past some of them in this video. The source code for today's video is available to download using the link in the description. You'll also find links there to sign up for my mailing list and for my Patreon. Patreon members will be notified soon about my upcoming live stream tests that will be run exclusively for Patreon members. Once I get the live streaming worked out, I'll open it up to everyone. Mailing list members are the first to hear about upcoming sales and new course launches. Finally, please let me know what you think of Blazor in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts on what you think of this technology. Okay, let's get started. Now, I have the preview version of Visual Studio here, and I had the latest update, so the latest version of .NET Core 3, which is not yet released for general availability, and I had the latest version of Visual Studio 2019. However, that's not quite enough. There's more you have to do because Blazor is, like I said, really cutting edge. So you could go to extensions and try to install it, which I did, but that didn't give me the templates that I needed to. So instead, what you need to do is you need to go to this page, and I'll link this down in the description. But it's to NuGet, you're looking for the Microsoft.AspNetCore.Blazor.Templates. Now these templates are for Visual Studio itself. This is not a NuGet package you install for an application. It's a NuGet package you install for Visual Studio. Now notice down here that if we look at the versions, by default you would get version 0.7.0. This is what you get if you go just to this page. However, what you want is Preview 7, which was released at this point when this video was made just 18 days ago. Now it has a command line here, but this is not the command line you want to run. It's close, but not quite right, because we need to install it for Visual Studio. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up a PowerShell window and just paste it in there so you can see it. Like I said, I've already run this, but let me at least show you the command. Now again, I will paste this exact command in the description below. But you run .NET new -i and then the full path of that template, that NuGet package. So as you see here, where it's saying that it's version 3.0.0-preview 7 that's this right here. That's : and that version. So first the name, so Microsoft.AspNetCore.Blazor.Templates, which is this right up here. And then you put 2 colons and then the version. I'm telling you this because it may be that when you're watching this or when you come back to watch it again, that there's a newer version of the template. And so if you want, you can install Preview 8 if it's out, or Preview 9. And the pattern is the same. You just need to put the version here of whatever preview you want. Okay? Now make sure Visual Studio is closed when you run this command. When you run this command, it's going to install the preview version of Blazor templates for Visual Studio. Okay, so with that being done, now you can come over here to Visual Studio and you can create a new project. And you want to create an ASP.NET Core web application. In the description, it does say Blazor. Now be careful, it's Blazor, not Razor. Slightly different. So let's call this project Blazor Demo. I'm going to call this just Blazor Demo as well, a solution name. And the reason for that you'll see in just a minute. But the solution name is Blazor Demo. The project name, I really hate doing that. Let's just call it App. I like to keep them separate just so I don't have any namespaces that are the same, where it's confusing. Is it the namespace for the solution or the project? So let's just call it Blazor Demo App and Blazor Demo. Now hit Create. Now I have my choice here. Make sure that you have .NET Core selected at the top and .NET Core 3.0. If you're not using the preview version of Visual Studio, you may not have access to .NET Core 3.0 or ASP.NET Core 3.0. You have to have Core 3.0. Now if we scroll down here, we'll see a few different Blazor possibilities. A Blazor server app, a Blazor core hosted, and a Blazor client side. And that's all we have. So which one do you choose? Well, for this video, we're going to choose the Blazor ASP.NET core hosted solution. This is going to give us actually 3 different projects. We're not going to look at the server app or the client side. The client side is just the client side. The server side is just the server side. We want basically a combination of the two. So ASP.NET Core hosted. It will hit Create. Now what this will do is it will create 3 projects for us. Let's shrink them down so you can see them. So you have the client, the server, and shared. So there's 3 different projects for us out of this one, what looked like one project we were adding. It actually added 3 projects for us. So let's talk about what these are. So the server side is basically just an API. So if you look at our controllers, we have a weather forecast controller. And this really is just a demo they put in place so you can see how to work with Blazor. So they gave us some starter code to work with, which is really helpful because it gives us a template to work off of instead of having to guess about how all these different things work. So this is the server side. It's just really an API. It inherits from controller base, and it has just one endpoint. It's an HTTP GET, and it's just GET for weather forecast, and it returns 5 weather forecasts. And it's just random data. It's just dummy data to show off what an API might look like. So that's the server side. Nothing really special here. Just a quick and dirty server. So let's look at the client side. This is where the Blazor stuff happens. This looks like a typical, maybe a Razor Pages app or an ASP.NET Core MVC app, where you have your www root folder, which has CSS and an index.html. And that index.html starts off with just 2 things. It has the loading, and then it has this blazor.webassembly.js. For pages, notice we have something different here. We have an extension of .razor, not CSHTML, Razor. And what that does is that indicates that it's a Blazor page. And yes, I know it's confusing because it's Blazor, but the extension is Razor. And Razor and Blazor sound similar, and yes, that's confusing. I wish they would have named things a little bit differently, but naming is hard. Let's look through what we have here. Let's start with looking at the app.razor, which is really simple, and it has a not found content. And so not found content is if you couldn't load something, it's going to run this message right here that says, sorry, there's nothing to be found at this address. Basically similar to a 404. We have an imports, which is going to import a number of things that we want to use with Blazor. One of those is BlazorDemo.Client. Does that sound familiar? Well, yes, because we're currently in the project BlazorDemo.Client. And we have BlazorDemo.Client.Shared. We'll get to that in a minute. So there's some basic setup stuff that you probably aren't going to touch at first. But this imports here is allowing us to bring in various things into our application. Let's get into the where is actually Blazor code to look at. Let's look at the index page instead of pages. The index page is an example of a Blazor page, but it's very, very simple. We have the @page directive. This tells us what the path is to get to this page. In this case, the path is just a slash, which means that this is just the root of our application. So if we just go to localhost : whatever the port number is, and that's it, that'll take us to this page right here, which says hello world, welcome to your new app. And then it has this new type called survey prompt. Well, what is survey prompt? If we look at the shared folder, we have survey prompt.razor. So we've created our own little snippet of code that we can reuse multiple times as a tag. This is a Razor component. So we have our div, which it's just an alert, and it's passing a title, and it's just demonstrating that we can pass in a parameter to this title. So here we're passing in the parameter of title, and then over here we're capturing that as a parameter and then using it here. Okay, so a little confusing at first. I'm going to get through some basics here, and I'm going to show it to you, and then we'll talk about Blazor and how it really works. Okay, so I hope I'm not losing you here. I don't want to lose you at this point. This is just basic overview stuff before we actually see it in action and talk about it. Okay? So this is the basic structure of a Blazor page. But let's go to a different page that has the full structure. So let's look at the counter page. This is more of a full structure. So first we have the page directive. That tells us what the path is to call this page. It's /counter. Then we have our HTML. Pretty simple stuff. And if you're familiar with the Razor syntax, which is how we insert C# into, let's say, a ASP.NET Core web page or into a Razor page, either one, then this looks very familiar. It's just in the C# code. So we have normal HTML, but whenever we want C# code, we put an @ in front of it and then just call it. Cool, but there's a few things that are a bit different. The big one right now is this @code section. This @code section is fully C#. This is where we have, for example, a declaration of a method, which then gets called up here in the code. So why do we have C# code right in the page? Well, think of what this is replacing. This is replacing client-side code. Now, in ASP.NET Core web apps, we run all of our code on the server. That's where our C# code gets run. And then what happens is the client receives just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. They don't receive C# code. But in Blazor, we send down C# code on the page itself. That way, we can run the code when the user does something. So the user says, I want to increment the count, we actually do the work without going to the server. So we have to have C# code on the client side. And that's what we have right here. So this is the code, and then we call that code. So this is the basic structure of the Blazor client-side page. Let's see this in action. So we make it a little more concrete in your mind what's happening. Then we'll come back and look at why it's happening or how it happens. So let's run this in IIS Express. Just hit run. And this is just a basic template. I haven't touched anything or changed anything in any way. It's just out of the box how it works. So it's spooling up a local host. And here is, I've got it zoomed in here, so let's zoom back out from it. This is the standard look of the page. Now I'm going to zoom in again to 175. Just make sure that this is nice and big for you on your screen and you can see it. Now this is using Bootstrap 4, so it's nice and responsive. We have the things like the mouse over that gives you some nice effects. But if you go to that counter page, watch when I click this. Notice the counter is going up. Now, if we had this in an ASP.NET Core web app, that would be going back to the server each time and coming back down with a new page with the new value. This is not doing that. This instead is doing everything on the client side. How do we know that for sure? Well, if we hit F12, I'm going to pull this up and try and get both things on the screen at once. I don't like to have my browser tools in line, but I think I'm going to for this demo. So let's put them at the bottom. So now if we look at the network and look at what's happening. So let's make sure we know what's happening when I click the button. Notice there's no network calls here. Nothing's happening. And the reason for that is because we're not going to the server. We're still doing everything locally, which means if I did hit refresh on this page, first of all, it's going to show me now the load of everything I'm loading from this page, but it resets the counter to 0 because the server didn't get any values. It was just on the client side, which does make it very responsive. Now, while we're here, let's talk about what actually gets loaded when we load a page. First of all, notice the total size of our transfer, 2.2 megabytes. That's how much was transferred down from the server for this page. Now, if you're talking about a simple page like this, it would seem like there'd be less than that. But this includes all of C#, which is pretty impressive because C# normally is massive. But that's one of the differences about Blazor is it doesn't use the traditional C# framework or .NET Core or something like that. It uses Mono. So Mono, they've trimmed down and created a WebAssembly version of Mono. And this is how all this magic happens, is WebAssembly. WebAssembly is a tool that's built into all modern browsers. So even your browsers that work on your phone can use WebAssembly. This is not a Microsoft thing. This is not the bad old days of DirectX or other tools that would be just for Microsoft that somehow run in the browser. This is not Silverlight. Instead, what this is a cross-platform tool, again, not from Microsoft, from the HTTP standard that says this is how you run WebAssembly code in the browser. Microsoft said, cool, let's see if we can run C# using WebAssembly. Now, the C# code itself is not compiled to WebAssembly. Instead, Microsoft compiled Mono to WebAssembly. And we're running our C# code through Mono. That means that we actually have DLLs. Notice Blazor demo.client.dll. That's an actual DLL that's coming down to the client side. That's my client side code. So we're using Mono to translate what that DLL is into WebAssembly. Notice the other DLLs are coming down. For example, the shared DLL, the ASP.NET Core authorization and Blazor and components, metadata interfaces, and a whole bunch more. It seems like a lot, but the reality is at just 2.2 megabytes, That's not that bad, not for what we're getting. Now, if you don't disable cache, notice I have disable cache checked here. If I'm going to uncheck that and I hit refresh, notice now the total download is 8.3 kilobytes. That's awesome. So with caching, we're not going to download mono again. We don't need to. We have it once. Therefore, we can skip that step and say we have that in cache. Let's move on. So I'm going to check this again just to make sure that we don't have any caching issues affecting us when I'm making some changes. But just know that's there. Also notice that in the console, we have this debugging hotkey, which you may be thinking, well, aren't we debugging this currently? And the answer is no. We've got if we look at the sources, we don't actually have any C# code here. Notice we have WASM, which is the WebAssembly, and we have a whole bunch of code here that makes no sense, at least not to us as human readable. But we don't have anything C# related. But never fear. In our console, it says to launch the debugger, type Shift-Alt-D. So if I do Shift-Alt-D, it launches a new debugger window. And inside here, we have this file. Now, I'm going to pause at this point for a minute because you may not have been able to run this. It may have stopped for you and said, you can't do that. Let me pull up the error message that I got at one point. Look over here. Let's look at this error message. Now, I screenshot it because I received it and I fixed it, but I didn't know if it would come back or not for me later when I'm doing this demo. So this is the error message I got when I did the Shift-Alt-D. It said, unable to find debuggable browser tab. And it lists why it can't do that. And it says, okay, run this command here. Program files, x86, Google Chrome, yada, yada. And it actually has my correct localhost :54881, which is what I was trying to debug. However, I closed all of Chrome, I ran that command, and it didn't work. And the reason why is because Chrome has this thing where it says, are you sure you want me to close? I'm pretty sure you want me to run the background. And so it actually keeps Chrome open even if all the windows are closed. So if you encounter this problem, close all your browser tabs after highlighting this line and copying it. Highlight this line and copy it in your error message, not in mine, because yours will have a different port number. But highlight it and copy it and close all the Chrome windows. And then go to your task manager and make sure that Chrome is fully closed. So look for any Chrome.exe in your task manager. If there is one there, kill it manually. So right click and say end task. Once all of those are closed, then hit Windows key and R, and then paste this in and hit enter. That will open Chrome back up, and it will have the debug mode available. So that's one of those quirks that I encountered, and that's how to fix it. So what this does, this is a Chrome thing, it's not a Microsoft thing, but a Chrome thing that allows us to do debugging in Chrome. So with this is now the new DevTools window for me. If I go to File and expand this out, notice I have BlazorDemo.client and BlazorDemo.shared. If I open up Client and go to Pages, there's that counter.razor. This is actual C# code, and this is the page just how it looks in my Visual Studio. The really cool thing is, if I put a breakpoint, let's just say right there. So after we increment the count, let's close this out. So if I hit click me, notice it paused the debugger, and Now my breakpoint is right down here. Now this is still in the early phases of working. So there are still some quirks about it. For example, if you look at the local window, I don't have the value for current count in this local window. So it doesn't know the value of this. If I mouse over it, I can't see it. However, if we hit run here, let's go to fetch data instead. I'm going to put my breakpoint down here at the end of this for each for forecast. Now it's going to fetch data, and it's going to pause again, but this time, if you look at my local window, you can see forecast. If we expand that out, we can see we have summary is bracing, the temperature in Celsius is 28, the temperature in Fahrenheit is 82, but the date is can't handle type system dot date time, which means they just haven't figured out how to put date time into this from their C# code yet. It's, again, a work in progress. So it shows the value of this forecast, not in mouse over, but over in the scope window, but it doesn't show it for the counter page. So again, some quirks here, but you can see the progress they're making. The fact that we can even put breakpoints in C# code on the client side and potentially read values is pretty impressive. Now let's let this go again, and let's come back over here and let's look at this page here. So this is just, again, it's pulling from an API, and so it's got a table's worth of information that we can see. If we just click here, notice it said loading real quick, and then it loaded our data. So that's the kind of the front end, hey, let's run it and talk about it view of Blazor. But let's actually get our hands dirty in building something. So I'm going to close out these dev tools. Play around with these because they're pretty cool. But let's close this out. I'm going to leave it zoomed in at 175%. Let's close this out. And let's create a new page. Let's close everything out, all documents. And we're going to create a new page where we're going to talk about people instead of weather. And this will give us a good excuse to play around with different features and see what really happens behind the scenes when we play with Blazor. So let's start off with our server side. Let's just get an API very similar to this running. But instead what we'll do is we'll have it be called people. Now, this right here uses the weather forecast model. They didn't call it model, but they call it weather forecast. And where does that come from? Well, that comes from the shared project. So let's talk about the shared project. The shared project is used by both the server side and the client side. So notice the get here, that's the API saying you're going to return IEnumerable of type weather forecast. On the client side, if we look at the fetch data, come down here, it's saying I'm going to get a JSON async call to weather forecast. I'm going to get back an array of weather forecast, that model. So they both know about the same model. That is done because they both have access to this shared project. Now be very careful here. Blazor operates on the client side. That means that your C# code goes down in raw format to the client. The client could debug and view your C# code. That's the same thing that happens with JavaScript. JavaScript is all viewable by the client, unless you're running server-side JavaScript. That's something different. So if you're running client-side JavaScript, that's viewable by the browser. You can hit the F12 developer tools and go in and look at the JavaScript. Now there's minification and other things you can do to try and obscure that, but the reality is you can always reverse engineer it back to JavaScript. The same thing is true for this C# code, which is why you don't want to put in this shared project, you don't want to put protected code. This is not where you put code that might be proprietary or that might have server-side authentication calls or database calls or anything else like that. This is just for stuff that will live in the front end and in the back end. Basically, it's just for models. That's the big sharing mechanism between the two. So let's create a model here. So let's say, oops, got it come off my screen here. So add, just saying add new class or new item class, and let's call this the person model. This is my pretty standard class for demos. And in here, we're going to have a first name, a last name, a account balance, which is decimal type. Let's just say, like, it's your checking account or saving account, something like that. It's your account balance. And then one last one we're going to have is full name. Now, full name is going to be just a read-only property that is a combination of first name and last name. I'm going to do it a little bit different than I might otherwise do it. I'm going to say public string full name and do a lambda expression. This is kind of a shortcut which makes things a lot easier. So first name space last name and a semicolon. So what this is doing is saying this is a property, even though it doesn't have the curly braces here. This lambda expression says this is what you return when you call full name. You return first name space last name. So there's no need for curly braces here. It kind of assumes that, and it assumes it's read only. So this is the equivalent of full property that's read only. Notice when I mouse over it, it says full name with only a get. So that's kind of a neat shortcut to make our lives a little easier. So full name is just first name space last name. And that'll be important for one of our demos. Now let's add a controller to our server side. So a new controller. We want it to be an API controller that's empty. We're going to call this the person controller. And once this scaffolds it out, we'll have something that looks very similar to the weather forecast controller. Waiting for it and waiting for it. Okay, so I had to pull some code down there, which is why, or some packages, which is why it took a little bit. But now we have this, let's create a get command. So HTTP get, but I want to oh, by the way, let's take off API slash and just say controller. Normally with APIs you have, your URL, so localhost :1234/API/ whatever the controller name is. But with this pattern here, they said let's drop off the API because we're going to be all calling this as we don't need to differentiate API versus web. So I'm just going to follow that same pattern. So it's controller. So we're going to HTTP get, but for this call, I actually want to call /person/ let's say all. So to do that, I'm just going to set up a route, and for this, I'm going to say all. Now, do you have to do this? No. I just want to demonstrate the fact that yes, you can name your route something other than the default. So public IEnumerable of type person model, control dot to add that using statement for the shared project, and then get people. So this will get all the people that we have, let's say in our database or something like that. Now, we're going to simulate this. We don't need to actually set up data access. the data access from here back, that's the same as it would be for any other C# project type. That people sometimes get confused by that. Data access for MVC versus Blazor versus anything else is exactly the same. It's C# data access. So I have a video connecting C# to SQL the easy way. If you watch that video, you can use those techniques in this project or any other C# project to talk to SQL and get data. But in this case, we're just going to create some test data. So var output equals new list of person model. And you're saying, wait, that's a list, not an IEnumerable. Don't worry, a list is a type of IEnumerable. Oops. So we have our curly braces, and inside there, new person model. Let's create a few people. So first name equals Tim, last name equals Corey, and account balance equals, let's just start me off at $19.45. We have to say D at the end. I'm sorry, M, not D. M to indicate decimal. And yes, I understand that it would be more logical to say D, but the way I think of it is M for money. That's the primary reason you use decimal. Okay, I'm going to copy this. Let's paste it a couple more times. Put my comma there. And my semicolon at the end here. And now let's say Mary and John, Smith and Jones, and account balance. Let's say that Mary has 105.87 and John has, let's just say 115.32. So now you have three people that we're going to pass back. And to do that, we have to say return output. We could have just said return right here and been done. Let's just do that. The only downside of doing this is it makes debugging a little harder because we can't capture this list into a variable somewhere to then view before we send it back. So we have this get people. And let's create as well a post. So HTTP post. And for this one, I'm not going to change the route. So this is the standard way of doing it, which is public void post. We're going to pass in a person model. And that's it. Now, typically we'd save this to a database or do other processing to it, send it down through our business logic all the way through a data access. But in this case, I'm going to leave it blank for now. I'll put a breakpoint there so that if we ever call post, we can at least view the person object and make sure it's full. All right, so now we have our server side taken care of. We have this person controller. Now we can move on to the client side. To do that, let's minimize this, and we'll kind of pages, we'll right click. Now you'd think you can say add and say a Blazor page or something like that, but no, not really. So instead, let's say new item. And here we get to choose what type of page. And it's actually Razor component. That's what we want for our Blazor application. Again, confusing? Yeah, it is. You don't want Razor page or Razor view. Notice those are CS HTML files. You want Razor components. So we're going to call this, let's call it people. And we get this page structure, which has people at the top and then our code section. And that's it. So first we need to set up what is the path to this page. Well, it's at page, we're going to say /people. Okay, so if you go to /people, that will be this page. The next thing we want to do is add a using statement, because we want to access and use this person model class. Well, we could call it, Blazor demo or Blazor demo dot shared dot person model, but that's a little long, and just like C#, we want to have a using statement. So at using Blazor demo dot shared. So now I can just access it via person model instead. Finally, we need to talk to the API. That requires an HTTP client. So we need to get that somehow. Well, that's in our dependency injection system by default from Microsoft. Any class that's in our dependency injection system on this client-side app, we can access with inject. So I'm going to inject, not inject attributes, just inject HTTP client. We're going to call it HTTP. Now, why do I call it this? Well, I'm actually following the same model that the weather forecast, let's find that, the fetch data here, that injects the same thing, HTTP client, and they call it HTTP. So I'm following that same format. So that injects the HTTP client from our dependency injection system, which is just given to us by default. We didn't configure anything for dependency injection, but if we did, we could add our own classes here that we could then pull in using inject. Now let's set up a bit of code. The first bit of code we need is we need to work with a list of person model, because we're going to ask for that. So let's set up a list of person model. We'll call it people. Now I'm not going to initialize it yet because I'm going to initialize it when I get the value from the API. Next, I'm going to want to have some indicator of if this page is loading or not. And I want to show off hey, we're loading. So I'm going to create a Boolean is loading and set to equal to false to begin with, meaning we're not currently loading. Now let's create a method to load our people. So private async task load people. And what this will do is it will talk to our API. So we'll first set the is loading equal to true. And at the end, we'll set is loading equal to false. And why I'm doing this is because I want to be able to show the user that something is happening until it completes. Because we're going to call this asynchronously, and we'll have to wait until that's complete before we're going to show the data. So I don't want the user clicking that button over and over and over and over again, thinking it's not working, when in fact, we are loading. It's just that we're not done loading. Now I am going to simulate a delay here because I want to show off this loading dialog, and just calling the API locally and getting back sample data that doesn't even talk to the database is just way too fast to actually see the loading dialog. So let's do await task.delay for 2 seconds. So it's 2000 because 2 seconds this is milliseconds. So therefore 2 seconds is 2000 milliseconds. So just going to wait for that. And then we're going to say people equals await our HTTP dot get JSON async. And I want a list of person model. And I'm going to call, let's actually do our @ symbol first so we can have the slash in there, person/all. So what is this doing? It's doing a HTTP call to get JSON data asynchronously that's going to put in this format. It's going to deserialize it into this format. and I'm calling the API at person/all. Well, the API that we created, if we come back over here, it's all on the person controller. Notice our route is controller, that's person, so person/all. So with that being done, we now have a call to our API. Let's create some code up above to show that data and also put a button on the page that allows us to ask for some data. So @if, that's saying, hey, I know we're in HTML area here, but I want some C#. So if people equals null, meaning there's no records in people, then if is loading equals true, then let's just put a paragraph on the page and let's put some emphasis on this and say loading ... Now you could put a spinner here or something else to indicate that something is loading, but I think this is fine. But else, so it's not loading, but people is null. So let's put a button. The class equals btn and btn dash info. I think that's probably good. And then we're going to have an onClick method. So @onClick equals, I want you to call the load people. So @load people. Like so. And now we'll say load people. So that's what's going to happen. We have a button that's got a little bit of styling on it. Notice that's Bootstrap 4 styling. Then it has this @onClick. Notice the @ symbol indicates C#. So @onClick is one of the methods we can attach to on a button. And we're saying call the load people method. Notice I am not using parens here, so no open and close parens. It's calling the people method, but we don't pass in parens. So we're going to say load people in the button, and we're good to go. So if we run this just as it is right now, well, first we need some navigation. So let's put that in place. Then we'll at least see this portion of it. We won't see anything when people is not null, but we'll at least see this portion of it. So let's go to our nav menu under shared. So nav menu. And this is where we have our navigation. Notice that we have home, we have counter, and we have fetch data. So let's copy fetch data and paste. And this is going to add one new entry. The href is not fetch data, but instead that href is /people. So does people. So people. And I don't want to use this this OI-list-rich, which OI, by the way, is Open Iconic. That's a font you can use. And in this case, I'm going to continue to use it for now. We'll use the font awesome for another location, but for now, we'll just use this. So person. So OI-person. If you go to just Google Open-Ionic and look for their icons, they'll have a whole list of the different icons you can use. But let's say person, and we'll say people is the title for our navigation. So with that, let's start this back up and see if we can at least get to this page. So once this loads, then it should pop up fairly quickly with our new page. So here we go. We have a people tab now we can click on. If we click here, notice we have the load people button. If we click this, it says loading for 2 seconds and it goes away. So we have some actions that have happened, again, just client side. Even though it actually called the API, it's still doing that client side. Now, yes, it's making a call to the API, and that's a round trip, but we're not refreshing this page to do so. So now that works, let's talk through what do we do once we have people. And this is going to be a little bit of HTML code. I'm not going to copy and paste it because I want to make sure that you see what I do. But I did take this from a template. Let me pull that up just so you can see it. So this template right here is what I pulled it from. If you go to bootsnip.com, you can search for all kinds of snippets of code that just make your styling easier for Bootstrap. So I did this, and then I looked at the HTML and said, okay, these are the parts I like, these are the parts that I don't. You'll see a pretty hefty similarity between my code and this code. So even though I'm typing this out, I have done it before, and also I used that snippet to help me out. So we have this else statement here. So if people is not null, we have people. Therefore, I'm going to create, first of all, a div class equals row. And that's a row of data. Inside here, I'm going to put all of my people entries in little cards. That way, kind of wrap around and fill the screen with data. So inside here, I'm going to do a for each. I'm going to say person in people. So notice I'm reading from this people list in the code, even though I'm up here, because this C# code has access to this C# code. So inside here, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create, for each person, I'll create a div with a class equal to call-lg-6 and call-md-12, and let's set the margin on the bottom to be 2. These are all classes that are provided to us by Bootstrap. So what this does is says, hey, if you're on a large screen or bigger, then I want you to set the this div to be half of the 12 columns you have available. So take up 6 columns. If you're on a medium screen, then I want you to use all 12 columns. Anything smaller than that also uses all 12. Anything larger than large will use the 6. And then this is the margin, the bottom, and it's -2, which is the second size width. So there's, I believe, 6 size widths, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You get to choose which one you like best. So with that, I'm going to create a form, and inside here, I'm going to create a class equal to card border-primary and rounded -0, meaning don't round it. And inside here, I'm going to create a header. So div class equals card header. And I also want to have a padding of 0, the padding 0. And then inside here, yet another div. When you're using Bootstrap 4, get used to creating divs. So class equals bg-info for background. Info is one of the colors. So text is going to be white. And text is going to be centered. And the padding on the y-axis is going to be set to 2. One of the things that Bootstrap 4 allows us to do is it provides us these classes. So I set the text to white. I set the background to be a bluish type color. I center the text, and I set the padding on the y-axis, meaning the top and bottom, to be the second size amount. Normally, you would create CSS for that and then apply your own classes here. Bootstrap has done it for us. That way we don't have to create our own CSS or, even worse, create styles on our div. So instead of putting in CSS, we put CSS directly in our div. That's even worse. This allows us to do so without kind of stopping our flow. We can just add this stuff and keep going. All right, in here I'm going to create an H3, and we'll start with, inside here, an icon. So class equals font awesome and font awesome dash envelope. Notice I don't have font awesome installed yet. And then we'll say contact info. And then that should be it. Now to get started using Font Awesome, what you need to do is you go to Font Awesome's website, fontawesome.com, and I'm already logged in because I actually pay for Font Awesome, but you can't use the free stuff. I'm not going to show off anything that's not free. So you'd start using here, and then it's going to ask you to create a kit. Now for you, if you don't have an account, it's going to ask for your email address. Don't worry, that's a small price to pay for getting this Font Awesome. And in fact, you can unsubscribe from their email address or email list, no big deal. But I have a Blazor demo, which I've already set up. And with that, I can just copy this script tag. Okay, so I can copy that. And then I can use this in my project. Now, I got the Pro set up here, but I could just use the free version if I wanted to. So I'll still use free icons, just so you know, but that's what I'm using right now. Okay? So with that, let's go over here and go to under www root, go our index.html. At the very bottom of our head, I'm going to paste in that script tag. And now I have access to Font Awesome icons. So with that, now I can continue to add things here. So after the H3 tag, we want to add a paragraph tag with a class of margin of 0 and say let's just put a line break here, the contact information for @person dot full name. Notice I have IntelliSense here. So this is going to say this is the contact information for and the full name of the person, like Tim Corey. This is for each person here. So that's what's going to create in this little card header. Now, outside the card header, we have the card body. Div class equals card body, and that is a padding of 3 all around. Let's scroll up here, and then inside of that, we have div class equals form group. So we're going to create some form groups for the various items we have. The first one is going to be our first name. So div class equals input group. Oops, I keep hitting tab. Tab takes you outside the double quotes. So MB-2. And then inside there, we're going to have div class equals input group prepend. So it's going to put in front of our input group. So we're going to have little icons in front of the input group. We'll say div class equals input group text. And inside there we'll have an icon. Class equals FA dash-user. Now, I have IntelliSense, but it's saying I just have FA-envelope. That's because it's remembered that from up above, but that's obviously not the one I want. I want user. And by the way, this is text info, which is coloring the text. So outside that, I want to have input type equals text and a placeholder of first name. And then I'm going to have a binding. So at bind equals at person.firstname. Again, IntelliSense here. So this is the actual input field. So we have an input field for our first name so we can see it, but also modify it, which will allow us then to see if it really does modify it because the full name is first name and last name. So let's do this exact same thing with last name. So let's copy our form group and paste it again. Only this time we're going to say last name and last name. Now we're going to use the same icon. I couldn't really find an icon to indicate a first name versus a last name, and it looks kind of goofy, but at the end of the day, this is not about creating great HTML forms. It's about just making something that we can use in Blazor. So let's paste this one more time, and this one's going to be for our count balance. So let's scroll up here, and this is going to be account balance, and we're going to bind it to account balance. We actually don't even need a placeholder here because we're going to make this read-only. That way you can see it, and it looks the same as the others, but you can't modify it. It'd be kind of silly to allow someone to modify their own account balance. And for font, we're actually going to use the FAS and FAS dash or FA dash $sign. This will be the font awesome $sign for account balance. We also want to add one thing after the input. So we have our prepend, which is going to put the icon for the $sign, but afterwards we're going to put another icon. This one's kind of just a fun one. So div class equals input group append, which append is after, prepend is before. We're going to say div class equals input group text. And then we're going to have an icon to indicate what our account balance is. Is it good or is it not good? So let's have an if statement here. So at if person.account balance is greater than 100. So if that's true, create an icon class equals FAR FA dash smile. And I'm going to commit a bit of a cardinal sin here and say style equals color green. This is kind of a shortcut. I could have created CSS for this to make a green color and have it be named. And in fact, there is, I believe, a green in Bootstrap 4, but I didn't have the exact colors I wanted. So I'm just going to do this for this demo. So now I'm going to do the else if, and the balance is greater than 0. Since I'm doing else if it's greater than 100, it will do this. But if it's not greater than 100, but it is greater than 0, it will do this. In this case, I'm going to set the color to orange. You'd think it would be yellow, but yellow just doesn't show up well. So I want an orange to be a little bit different. And instead of a smile, I'm going to have a frown. And then finally, I'm going to have an else. And this else is going to have, instead of a smile, it's going to have dizzy. And the color will be red. So depending on your account balance, you'll either see a green smiley face, an orange frowny face, or a red dizzy face. Which dizzy face is actually, you'll see, it's interesting. So let's run this just as it is right now. We can see how this looks, and then we'll hook up some buttons to actually make some changes to this form. All right, so here's our people. We can say load people. We're waiting the 2 seconds. We paused. And now we have these cool little forms that have information in them. So for example, the contact information for Tim Corey. And I say, wait, officially, my name is Timothy. If I hit tab, watch this up here. Now it's Timothy Corey. That's all client side. There's no call to the server here. That was just a client side operation. Also notice my little frowny face here because I only have $19.45. Whereas Mary Jones has a smiley face in green because she has $105. She's above the threshold. So is John. All right, now let's wire this up to do some operations on it. So after this form group here, which you can collapse this down if it makes it easier to see and put a div afterwards, or you can just use the dotted lines. But after the form group, we want to put some more code. Let's put a div with a class equal to text-center. And inside here, we're going to put 2 buttons. Type equals button. And we're going to have an on-click event, which we don't have yet. So we'll wait on that. So class equals btn, btn-info. Let's set the rounded to be 0. The padding on the y-axis to be 2. The padding on the x-axis to be 4. And the margin on the left to be 2. And we'll have this button say, buy now. I think I actually want the margin to be on the right. Now I want another button. And this button is going to look a lot like this one. So let's just copy and paste. Only this one's not going to say buy now. It's going to say save. And instead of info, it's going to be danger, which is that red color. And we're not going to have the margin. Okay, so now you have 2 buttons, but we don't have it do anything yet. So let's wire up something for each of these to do. The first one, the buy now button, let's create a method that simulates the idea that we're going to buy something. Obviously, a one click where there's no shopping cart. This is just really simple stuff. So private void buy now. We're going to pass in a person model. Call it person. And say person dot account balance minus equals, and let's take away, let's say $5.15 each time. So we're going to subtract $5.15 whenever you hit buy now. No prompts, just that. And let's create another method that is private async task save user, again passing in the person model. Only this time we're going to call that endpoint. So await http.postJSON-async. And we're going to call the person controller. And this is a post. We don't have to give it any other path than that. And we're going to pass in that person object. So we're going to call the person, which if we look here under posts, we have in the person controller, we have post. Since it's not named like this one is, it's assumed that post lines up with just the controller name. So post, which means that down here when we say post and the controller name, it passes through that post method. And it's going to pass in the object. So now we have these two here. We can actually call them up above. So let's come down to the new line on each one of these. The first one is the buy now. So we're going to have the on click. And this is a little bit different because I can't just say buy now, because I have to pass in that person object. And it doesn't work quite that way. So instead what I need to do, I'm going to wrap this in parens and then create another set of parens and say the lambda expression, so it equals greater than buy now person. So I'm going to pass in to this anonymous method, I'm going to pass in buy now and call the person and throw in the person object. So it's going to call this method and pass in person, which comes from way up here, this for each as a person. We'll do the same thing for our save. So in fact, we can just copy and paste really because it's the same code. Only this is called save user. And it's the same command. I want to do this to kind of show you here's how you do that passing in parameters, because it's not as straightforward as the original call was up here where we just say load people. Now remember, we have a breakpoint on our post. So we'll get to that once we click the button. But first, let's run this and see if we can get that account balance to change. So we have people, load people. It's taking 2 seconds to load because of that break. And now we have our buy now and save buttons. If I click buy now, watch my account balance. It's now $14.30. Now it's $9.15. Now it's $4. Now watch the frowny face here as I click this one more time. Now I get that dizzy face, which is more the passed out kind of face. Like, oh my goodness, you just sent your account balance into the negative. And I can keep going. Same thing over here. I have the smiley face, but if I click the buy now button twice, I get a frowny face because I'm below $100. John Smith, same thing. We can keep going with John all the way down until he spends all of his money and he, like me, has that dizzy face. Now, let's just say that we're done making, well, let's make one more change. Back to Timothy, and now let's hit save. We want to actually post this information to the server. Notice I hit my breakpoint. If we look down here in the locals window, in the person object, I see the account balance of negative $37.20 and the first name of Timothy and the last name of Corey. So it passed that object back to my API. Now I could save that in the database, or I could do other things with it. So I do have that interactivity from front end to back end, but at the same time, I didn't do a full page refresh. If I hit continue, the data is still there. So John Smith is still in the negative, Mary Jones is still under 100, and I am still at negative $37.20. Unlike what MVC would do or Razor Pages would do, this has not refreshed the entire page. It has not reloaded all this data. Instead, it just made a call behind the scenes without the user really even knowing anything else happened. There is no disruption to the user's flow. So that's really the power of Blazor, just like JavaScript. We've gotten so used to websites now where things happen on the front end without a refresh. And that's the power of JavaScript typically. Well, now we can use C# to do that same work. Now, there's a lot more to cover about Blazor. For instance, you can have authentication set up so you can log in the front end securely and safely and have that login work the same as it would in, let's say, an ASP.NET Core application. So That's a big thing. There's some other things as well, bringing in components and using static content and the rest. But I think that's a good starting point, at least, for you to play around with Blazor. Like I said, there's a lot more to cover, but at the same time, we've got some time, because this definitely shouldn't be something you're putting into production today. This is something where you're learning about it and you're learning how it works and interacting with it, but you're not yet putting it into projects. I would recommend you keep an eye on this, because this is definitely something you'll want to think about when you're working with web projects. Let's say in 3 months or 6 months from now, you'll want to at least consider, is Blazor ready for us to use it in the front end? Because having Blazor in the client side allows you to be able to reuse the skills of either yourself or your team. So if you know C# already in the back end, now you can use those same C# skills on the front end. You have an end-to-end process for web applications. Whereas today, you probably should have some JavaScript knowledge. And unfortunately, JavaScript isn't something you can dabble with. JavaScript gets very deep very quickly, especially if you need to do anything with any intensity on the front end. You should know a lot about JavaScript. This allows you to bypass that and use just Blazor. But never fear, there's a lot of stuff out there for JavaScript that isn't there for Blazor. But Blazor can use those components in your application. So we've covered a lot of information so far with this demo. I would encourage you, create your own application, try it out, build it, see what you get, see what errors you bump into or what issues you come in contact with, and try and work through them. Don't just ask, hey, I broke something, what went wrong? Try and figure it out yourself. This is a little bit of experimentation, but if you can't figure it out, then maybe ask in the comments down below, or definitely Google it first though. Make sure that Google doesn't have the answer for you, okay? And also, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on this. I'd love to hear, the pros and cons from your perspective and what you're most excited about for Blazor. Okay? There is a link in the description for this source code, so you can download that, so you can play around with exactly what I did, and maybe if yours didn't work quite right, you can compare that with what I did and see if you see a difference. Don't forget, you do have to have 2019 preview on with .NET Core 3 and add in those templates. Okay? Thanks for watching, and as always, I am Tim Corey.